Sahana Vavadu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyam Karavavahi Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahi. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om. We are continuing our discussion on Swami Vivekananda's contribution, his approach to religion and philosophy in modern times. But before we begin our regular talk, I think it is good for us to remember that Swami Vivekananda has made a significant contribution to San Francisco city itself. Before he passed away in 1902, July 4th, he instructed Swami Tattwamayananda, who was another disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, to come to San Francisco and take up the responsibility of leading the Vedanta society here. That was the early part of 1902, before Swamiji passed away. And Swami Tattwamayananda reached San Francisco on January the 2nd, 1903. So Swamiji had passed away in 1902, July 4th. And before he passed away, he had given clear instruction to one of his brother disciples, Swami Tattwamayananda, to come to San Francisco and take up the responsibility of leading the Vedanta society here. So Swami Tattwamayananda reached here in San Francisco on January the 2nd, 1903. He was born in the year 1865 and passed away in San Francisco on January the 10th, 1915. That means he spent almost more than 12 years here. And he was the one who actually laid a strong foundation to what we have right now in San Francisco. Vedanta Society, especially the old temple, which was his creation. So it is good for us to remember that we are celebrating Swami Tattwamayananda's birth anniversary on 15th February, that is tomorrow, Monday. So let us remember both Swami Vivekananda and also Swami Tattwamayananda with great gratitude for what they did for San Francisco and for their significant contribution for enriching the city and its civilization and culture by bringing Vedanta movement to this part of the country. So that is a very important point we have to remember. Now, coming back to the subject now once more, when we talk about Swami Vivekananda, who was essentially a monk, a man of God, a man of spirituality and religious tradition, frequently there are two approaches that we find current in modern times. The traditional Indian approach will be to extol him as a great spiritual teacher, and that is certainly his greatest and most profound identity, the great spiritual teacher who brought Vedanta movement to the United States. But though he was a religious teacher, he was a monk, he was also a very modern man with a very high sensitivity to what was happening in the 19th century, because he was himself a product of the best kind of modern education prevailing in the last decade in the later half of 19th century. He had studied European history, European thought, Western thought. He was familiar with the Greco-Roman culture and civilization, and also he was very familiar with India's own ancient spiritual heritage. So essentially he was a man of religion, a man of God. He was a monk from beginning to end. But he had many interests. He was a very profound student of history, of philosophy, of the dynamics of culture and civilization, how civilizations and culture rise and fall, and what sustains ancient civilization and why some civilizations disappear altogether. In fact, he represented the universal spiritual aspirations of mankind, but in the process he presents before us a profound idea, a profound philosophy of religion, spirituality, based on the twin principles of harmony and synthesis. It's very important for us to think of what he thought of an ideal society. Now, when we talk about Vivekananda, you find that he believed in the idea of synthesis and harmony, as I mentioned. Not only in the context of India's culture, but also in the context of world culture. He believed that the best elements of the Occidental, the Western, the Greco-Roman tradition and the values that it represents, and the best values, cultural and civilizational elements of India's spiritual tradition should be harmonized, and this harmony and synthesis will be a very wonderful foundation for an ideal society, an ideal way of life to go even beyond that. Now, when we talk about his ideas of an ideal society, an ideal civilization, an ideal culture, it'd be very interesting for us to compare his views with those of some of the very prominent Western historians of 20th century, and also those who made significant contribution to world history and historiography in the later half of 19th century. There was a great historian, and many of you must have known about him. In fact, he was the forerunner of what we call macro history, which is perhaps best represented by Arnold Toynbee, considered to be the greatest historian of 20th century. Swami Vivekananda were traveling in Eastern Europe in 1896, that is 18 years before the beginning of the First World War. He makes some very strong predictions which are surprising and also shocking. For example, you can just imagine Vivekananda, the great student of history and civilization and culture, and above all a compassionate lover of humanity. He was traveling in Europe, mostly in Eastern Europe, and Swamiji writes, Europe is on the verge of a volcano. Unless the fires are extinguished by a flood of spirituality, it will blow up. Swamiji says. And in another context he says, Europe, the center of the manifestation of material energy, will crumble into dust within 50 years. Swamiji said this in 1896. And 18 years later, in the year 1914, we saw the beginning of the First World War. So within less than 18 years, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated. That is the beginning of the First World War. So Swamiji saw what was happening in Europe. So his power of prophecy and prediction. Now, why did he make a statement? He made the statement because he found that every nation was trying to make itself ready for war. That's why he made this statement, we want harmony, not one-sided development. Unless we take care of the spiritual aspect of human life, without paying too much of attention or paying only attention to material benefits and development, human civilization itself could be threatened. And in fact, the great German historian and thinker, he was Oswald Spengler. He wrote the well-known book, which in English the title could be The Decline of the West or Downfall of the Occident. It was published in 1918, less than a year after the First World War came to an end. In that book, that is long before Hitler entered the scene, which led to the Second World War, the great German historian and thinker made this prediction that we are heading for a catastrophe. Almost echoing what Vivekananda had stated 15 years earlier. The first volume of Spengler was published in 1918, and the second volume came a little later. So Vivekananda's predictions were echoed by the great European thinkers and historians of his own times. They were younger contemporaries to him. And this ominous prophecy of the end of Western cultural tradition, based on his own analysis of European history and what was happening in Europe in the 19th century, led him to make this horrible prediction that there could be problem in Europe. And it really happened. We know what happened, the ideological, the military and the political revolutions and uprisings that took place in Europe. 1 year before he published this book, in 1917, there was Bolshevik revolution in Russia. And then, of course, what happened in China and other countries. So what I mean to say, Vivekananda, with this prophetic vision, thought of humanity, thought of civilization as something that can survive only if it harmonizes its values, its material values, with the universal humanistic ideas of spirituality. And when in Toynbee went even further, he clearly emphasized the point that the West needs India's spirituality. Though in modern times it may sound a bit jingoistic to repeat even Toynbee's statements, but that's what Toynbee actually said in his own books. He said that we need a religion. And he was perhaps the greatest macro historian the world has ever seen. He said, we need religion, not a doctrinal religion, not a religion that divides humanity, but a religion that harmonizes, unifies humanity under a spiritual umbrella. And he said human civilizations will crumble down unless spiritual values are harmonized to human life. And in fact, he considered that the civilizations are not murdered, they commit suicide, in his own words, when they are not able to meet the challenges. So he challenge and response theory. Vivekananda also said the same thing. So you can imagine what Swamiji said was often repeated by the greatest historians of 20th century. Toynbee said, civilizations and cultures do not commit crimes against each other, but they sometimes commit suicide when they forget their own fundamental, essential core values on which their life system is built. And Vivekananda himself says the same thing. He says every civilization, every culture, every nation has its own inherent core value, its own genius. It is this genius that it's contributing the totality of human cultural heritage. And he gives the example, for dynamism, the proactive spirit symbolized by the Greco-Roman heritage, or the arts, music and literary diplomatic traditions of the relatively modern European countries like Italy, France, Germany or Britain. And also India's spiritual values, maybe the ethical, moral discipline emphasized by the ancient Confucian tradition of ancient Chinese civilization, the concept of national unity represented by the Japanese spirit. So Swamiji says, many of these core values should be synthesized, harmonized. And then only civilization will be able to face challenges ahead of them. Toynbee explains the mysterious phenomenon of the rise and falls of civilizations. When a civilization fails to meet a challenge, that civilization disappears. That's what happened to many of the pastoral civilizations. Some of them, based on pastoral culture, they disappeared. So he emphasized this harmony and synthesis. Now we can try to understand this in the context of Oriental culture and Occidental culture. Swamiji says we wanted harmony, not one-sided development. And it is possible to have the intellect of Shankara with the heart of Buddha. Sometimes there are discords, but they only make the subsequent harmony more perfect. So diversity is welcome. We should celebrate diversity and differences, because differences and diversities will help us to harmonize and synthesize. So the otherness need not make us feel alien. Rather, it is another way of expressing the same universal spirit. In the context of Indian society, his analysis is very profound and very revolutionary. Of course, this may be better appreciated once we understand the dynamics of the historical movement of Indian society. For example, his analysis of Castism. Swamiji says Castism in its original form was just a kind of division of labor. Brahmins were those who, just by temperament, showed a tendency to meditate, to study scriptures, and to make contributions to philosophy. Kshatriyas were those who were active and dynamic by temperament. Vaishyas were those who were naturally interested in business and industry. And Shudras were those who emphasized the physical effort behind everything. So he says these divisions of labor, these classifications were not based on birth. They were based on human temperament, which could be found in every culture, every society. One could move backward and forward by acquiring higher qualities. A person can begin his life or her life as a man of action, as a woman of action, a Kshatriya. Afterwards, if that person takes interest in philosophy and contemplation and spiritual disciplines, that person becomes a Brahmana. So these temperaments, they all enriched human personality and human civilization. And he emphasizes the fact that every civilization had this kind of division of labor, which is based on temperament. Each of these groups has its own unique contribution to make, just as every nation in the world has its own contribution to make the totality of human civilization and culture. That's why he says the activism of the Occidental tradition, heritage, the Greco-Roman heritage, should be harmonized with the contemplative spirit of the Oriental. It doesn't mean that Oriental civilizations were always highly contemplative, not at all. What Swamiji says is, each of these cultures has its own uniqueness. The uniqueness doesn't make it either superior or inferior. It makes it unique. It's an equally important contribution it makes to us enriching the totality of human civilization. And he says, so far all plans of religious harmony have produced more sects fighting, struggling, pushing against each other. Amidst this chaos of various forms of religion, there is harmony throughout this discordant sound. There is a note of concord. Each race, each nation has its own mission to perform, its duty to fulfill. The sum total is the great harmony. Somehow we find this aspect is missing in Toynbee's work. I think that's what makes the major difference between a spiritual prophet, spiritual thinker, and a great historian. Because a great historian, he analyzes historical events and he analyzes how we ourselves interpret those historical events, and he comes to his own conclusions. But a prophet looks far into future. He can see farther into future, and he can see deep into the central, the undercurrents and central themes and undercurrents of each civilization. So Swamiji says, each nation, each civilization has its own unique contribution to make. Now, there is something very interesting in this context with regard to Swamiji's analysis of society. How does a society become ideal? He says, when a society makes its best use of its resources by making the best use of science and technology, its intelligence and intellectual resources, without forgetting its spiritual foundation, then that society becomes an ideal society. That's why he says we cannot be one-sided. But Toynbee also mentioned this point. One-sidedness sometimes leads to exclusivism, otherness, and a mistaken sense of superiority, which have happened to many of the world civilizations at some point or other. This harmony or synthesis of the best of the traditional and the best of the modern, the best of the spiritual and the best of the scientific technological, the best of the religious spiritual and the best of the secular. This is possible only through evolution. It is not possible through revolution. It's a very wonderful idea that you find in Vivekananda's writings. And we should remember, Swamiji finished most of his important writings before, at his lectures, before 1901, because he passed away in 1902. And he made all these predictions mostly based on his own understanding and study of the great social reform movements and the massive changes that Europe and to some extent America witnessed during the 18th and 19th centuries. He was a keen student of America's independent struggle against the 13 colonies asserting its freedom and sovereignty from British the British Crown. So he was a keen student of America's own transition from 13 colonies under the British rule to an independent state with its own sovereignty. And he was a keen student of the French Revolution. You can find him referring to Rousseau, Robespierre and other French thinkers who influenced the social reform and the French Revolution. You can find him referring to the emergence of Napoleon as a result of the chaos created by the French Revolution and so on. So he says, revolution is a change that is thrust upon a society from outside, from without. It frequently replaces what it wants to change with something far worse. Revolution will always end up in replacing the old with something new, and that new will be far worse than what it actually tried to replace or to change. Evolution is an inner growth. Evolution is possible when societies and nations and cultures and civilizations, they learn from each other. Every civilization has a lot to learn from every other civilization. Every culture has a lot to learn from other cultures. When we learn from other cultures, other civilizations, we enrich ourselves and we evolve. That evolution is called growth. And that evolution is always a change for the better, a change for the nobler, a change for something creative. And in this context, we find him sometimes echoing Toynbee's own views. For example, Toynbee talks about the important role played by a small minority, what you call a creative minority in Toynbee's words. He was the one who formulated this complex theory of the growth and demise of civilizations. So he says that ideas and methods and the fundamental values of a civilization are created by a small creative minority. It is not a violation of the principles of democracy by any stretch of imagination. It's a statement that comes from a thinker who analyzed the rise and falls of civilizations. Swamiji also agrees with this view. Of course, Swamiji, he formulated and articulated his views maybe around 70 years before Toynbee. Swamiji said that some of the core values, the fundamental principles that evolve a high culture or civilization are the contribution of a small creative minority. Now, when we look at this perspective, you can find in every culture, every nation, every civilization, there is a small number of people who sacrificed to practice and to implement certain higher values. These values contribute, in fact, these values formulate the fundamental teaching, the essence of the particular civilization. We may call it a genius of a culture or civilization. For example, he says India's genius is in spirituality and religion. The Greco-Roman tradition has evolved this unique concept of nation-state, the principles of democracy, modern concepts of citizenship, right from early days onwards. So every civilization has its own genius. And that genius is a contribution of this creative minority. Now, when a society tries to reform itself, when it tries to move forward, it should do so without forgetting these fundamental roots on which the society is built, these foundations on which the social fabric is built. Then it becomes evolution. And evolution means a growth, it means a change for the better, for the nobler, for the more creative, for the more beneficial. It is a change that happens from within. It is not a change that is thrust upon society from outside. It is part of the momentum of social movement. Revolution, on the other hand, is essentially destructive, because you are thrusting a change on society for which the society is not ready. So, in all examples that you find in history, every revolution resulted in bringing for something far worse than what it originally wanted to change, to reform. As happened in French Revolution, the chaos that followed. On the other hand, American transition was a glorious example of creative evolution. From 13 colonies, it became a great nation state. Though it involved some conflict, still it was not a change that was thrust upon these 13 colonies from an alien power. Rather, they themselves united and asserted their rightful freedom. Swamiji says this is applicable to individuals also. He mentions this point very often in the context of India's social and economic problems. Swamiji says that, especially when he addresses youngsters in India, students who are coming out of the universities established by British rulers, they had lost all faith and all sense of national pride. They were trying to throw away their own heritage. They started thinking of blindly imitating the Europeans, British rulers, by alienating themselves from the fundamental core values of Hinduism, Hindu tradition, and so on. While addressing them, Swamiji says, and he uses the word mustache babies, a very strong word he uses when he addressed assemblies of young men whom he found to be totally lost between two worlds. They had lost faith in their own tradition, at the same time they had not fully adapted to Western ways of life. So Swamiji says, you cannot forget your own tradition, your own culture, and grow and evolve and become better human beings. Every change, every reform movement should be accomplished without losing our own focus, our own tradition, our own traditional cultural values, he says. Another important contribution of Vivekananda to social reform was something much more important. He talks about religion and philosophy and their practicality. Vivekananda called it practical Vedanta. So religion gets a new meaning in Vivekananda's interpretations. Swamiji says a religion has no value unless it becomes practical. And it becomes practical only when it becomes spirituality. If it remains a religion, it is just a bundle of dogmas and doctrines. You have to remember, Toynbee himself did not reject religion completely, but when he talked about religion, he always emphasized that religion, in his view, should be totally free from dogmatism and fanaticism. It should be a universal spiritual ideal. That's what Toynbee himself said. We don't know, but most probably Toynbee was familiar with Vivekananda's works. We cannot be sure about it. But one point is very, very clear, that Swamiji's views on religious thought, emphasizing the practicality of religion in our everyday life, is a unique contribution coming from him. Because before Vivekananda, in India, religion was traditionally considered to be the monopoly or the privilege of a small group of people who were familiar with Sanskrit language, who were trained in scriptures, and who frequently spoke in Sanskrit. That was the social condition. Of course, during Shankaracharya's time, this situation was fully understandable, fully justified, because religion at that time was mostly a way of life which actually was real only for a small number of Sanskrit educated elite. But Shankaracharya lived in 8th century AD and Vivekananda came 1100 years later, in 19th century AD. So there is a difference of almost 1100 years. So Swamiji said that religion, to be effective, to be useful, should become practical. And it should help us not only in spiritual matters, it should also give us a personality, a sense of self-confidence to face the challenges of everyday secular life. That's why you find him paying importance to secular education. Though Vivekananda was essentially a monk, he was the first great educationist in India, historically speaking, who emphasized the need for secular education, especially among the masses. He emphasized the need for educating youngsters, not only in humanities, in history and literature and other subjects which is common in those days, but also in technical matters, so that they will be able to find a job after their education. They themselves will be able to stand on their own feet. So every kind of education should be creative. Now, that kind of education is possible only if people who went to schools and colleges had a creative, constructive upbringing. The problem with India was those who were religious minded were totally impractical. They didn't pay much attention to practical things. Mostly they were interested in philosophical debates and discussions. Swamiji said, religion should be practical. And when religion becomes practical, it should become spirituality. And when religion becomes spirituality, it should become humanism. When it becomes humanism, it should lay the foundation for a universal spiritual ideal, treating every human being as equal. A kind of education that should help us to stand on our own feet. Religion and education were inseparable in India's context during Vivekananda's times. That's why we are looking at this from this perspective. In modern times, when we look at the whole picture, things are somewhat different. Today's situation is far different. Today we can have the best of education without the help of religion or religious hierarchies. In Europe and other countries where the universities were historically the contributions, the work of the great theologians and the monasteries and monastic orders, even in this country during the early part of 19th century, many of the great schools were founded by great movements, by great philanthropists with a strong religious outlook. But today, education has become secular. Swamiji says education can become secular, but it should not be detached from spiritual values. Because spirituality is the applied form of religion. So, you can find this unique interpretation. Spirituality is practical, religion should become spiritual, then it becomes practical and should be applied in our everyday life, in everyday activity. It is not something confined to temples and churches and places of worship. It is something that should become a creative force in our everyday life and activities and thoughts. Toynbee, of course, he articulates his own views on the importance of religion. But he says, without religion, what will be the meaning of life? Religion is necessary, according to Toynbee, to give us a meaning and purpose, a sense of purpose of human life. That's why he refused to reject religion. He remained a Christian, as he himself admitted, but he was an enlightened Christian in a very universal sense. He was a man who believed in the fundamental spiritual values which are necessary for every human being and every civilization to survive, to sustain, to get a sense of meaning and purpose in life. Now, in Swamiji's view, this practicality of religion as one unique way of expressing itself in Indian context. He talks about the Guru Parambara and Acharya Parambara. One of his most well-articulated presentation was his lecture on the sages of India. It's a very famous lecture in which Swamiji traces the evolution. He describes the evolution of Vedantic ideal in Indian context. And you find him talking about the early teachers of Vedanta, beginning with the ancient Vedic rishis, the sages, the Vedic sages, then Rama, then Krishna, Buddha, then Shankaracharya and Ramanuja Chaitanya, and of course coming to 19th century, Sri Ramakrishna, his own guru. Swamiji, you can find him giving a picture, the graphic picture, the evolution of what we call Acharya Parambara, Guru Parambara in Indian context. In Indian spiritual tradition, you can find this unique mechanism. The tradition of gurus, the tradition of acharyas. Guru is a teacher, acharya is a teacher that comes from time to time, maybe once in a few centuries, who reinterpret the ancient values and implements those values in his own, her own life and transmits to the next generation. just like putting the old wine in a new bottle with a new label. Without this tradition, this unbroken succession of teachers and gurus, Indian civilization would not have survived. Swamiji admits that. And Indian society, Indian civilization would have vanished. In fact, Toynbee himself analyzes different religious traditions. And actually, he gives a picture of certain civilizations that self-destroyed themselves. He talks about Sumerian, Assyrian, Babylonian, and even Greek civilizations. Greek civilizations, it survives today because of Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, the great philosophical teachers, philosophers and teachers. We don't know, we don't have any living example of Greek way of life right now. Greece has completely changed. But if you go to India, and maybe if you go to China and certain countries like Japan, you find the old way of life still continues. I don't mean to say the old is always gold, not at all. But what it means is some of the great values and ways of life, what you call samskaras, practices, belief systems, they survive in spite of all the changes that have taken place, social cataclysm that has taken place for thousands of years. Swamiji himself makes a powerful statement when he returned to India in 1897. When he first landed in Colombo, he gave a talk next day in Floral Hall in Colombo. There he says, if Manu returned to India today, he won't find himself in a strange land. He won't be bewildered. Manu was the ancient lawgiver. And Swamiji says, if the ancient lawgiver Manu, who must have lived maybe 3,000 years before Christ, 5,000 years ago, if that great Vedic sage returned to India in 1897, you find the same India continues. Not the same way, but some of the core values remain intact. Now, Swamiji says it is due to the succession of the great teachers and sages who came from time to time, reinterpreted the ancient values and gave a new shape and gave to the next generation. Vivekananda himself belongs to that category of the great teachers and prophets who appear from time to time. Now actually, Swamiji's views on this cyclic rotation, the cyclicism of historical events, was a bit different from the views of Oswald Spengler, the German historian and thinker. According to him, history repeats itself. He believed in what he called the inevitability of cyclical movement of history. Everything happens according to these predeterministic principles of historical repetition. There is a set order according to which human civilizations come, go and reappear and again disappear and again come back. He believed in the repetition of historical events. But Swamiji did not believe in the repetition of historical events, but he believed in the evolutionary process. There is, of course, some kind of cyclicism, but it was different from the views expressed by Spengler. In fact, his views come closer to Toynbee's views, who also believed there is a momentum working from within the historical process. And there is certainly a repetition at the macro level, but history doesn't repeat itself in details. History repeats itself only in certain fundamental principles. So, in other words, you find in Vivekananda some of these very wonderful ideas. On the one hand, you find religion should be practical, It should have a practical expression. It should make a person believe in himself, should feel confident of his own destiny. He should be able to build his own destiny. He need not surrender his free will or freedom to God. God doesn't demand that you should surrender everything to Him. God doesn't want slaves. God wants free men. And according to Vivekananda, Advaita is the highest expression of the spiritual freedom, spiritual independence. He doesn't deny monotheism or pantheism or polytheism. Swamiji doesn't deny belief in the ancient idea, the pantheism which equated nature with God, or pantheism which believed that there's a spirit within every natural phenomenon, or polytheism, belief in many gods, a variety of gods, or believe in one monotheistic creator God. Swamiji did not reject it. But he said, as we evolve further and further, we come to a stage where we realize that God whom we worship is present in all of us, in our own being, as one impersonal reality, which is perhaps the broadest statement we can say about Advaita Vedanta. So he says, religious aspirations, and that the universal spiritual aspirations of humanity find their fullest and most sublime expressions in Advaita. Because when we believe Advaita, we believe that the divine being is within us, we should manifest this inner divinity by being good and noble and broad-minded and compassionate human beings. And that is the essence of practical Vedanta. Vedanta believes theoretically that the divine reality is one attributeless, impersonal, spiritual truth that is present everywhere, present in all of us. So we cannot hate anyone. We'll be hating ourselves if we hate somebody else. There is no otherness. So when we believe that, what happens is, it becomes our responsibility to manifest, to express the presence of the divine within ourselves. We cannot just outsource this responsibility to God. You make an agreement with God, you pray to God, you surrender to Him, and you be respectful towards Him, and your duty ends there. No, our duty only begins there. Religion begins in the temple and churches. It doesn't end there. It should end outside. So we should be able to see the presence of the divine outside the temple, outside the church, everywhere, in everything. When this happens, religion becomes practical. Then we express religion as spirituality. We express it in everything that we do, we think and we speak and we think, we act. Everything becomes a spiritual activity. Every moment becomes a circumambulation. Every thought becomes meditation. Every word becomes a mantra. And whole life gets spiritualized. That's how an ancient Vedic mantra, Vedic statement goes. This is Vivekananda's views of practical spirituality. I think apart from his views on history, cyclicism, society, social reform and other views, Vivekananda's unique contribution is this emphasis on practical Vedanta, practical spirituality, practical religion, religion applied in our everyday life, which expresses itself in our interactions with other human beings, not only human beings. So, in this respect, we can find him as a unique teacher of religious practicality. And his views on historical movement of civilizations and cultures are based on his idea of this religion in actual practice. He says, history is the gradual unfoldment of the universal spirit. You can find a famous statement in complete works. History is the gradual unfolding itself of the universal spirit. But it's again totally different from Spengler's rigid predeterminism in interpreting history. Totally different. What Swamiji says is, every civilization can express spirituality in all its various aspects. And every civilization, culture and nation and society has produced some unique spiritual beings. Some of them may not be known, may not be known outside the particular society in which the spiritual teacher takes birth. So he says it is inevitable that every civilization, every culture will produce its own spiritual heritage and will produce some of the greatest spiritual men and women the world has ever seen. That point he emphasized in his first Chicago address itself, which he develops in so many lectures and writings in later years. So we are just trying to take a broad view of some of Vivekananda's views on the evolution of society, culture and civilization, based on the fundamental principle of spirituality as a guiding force in this process of unfolding of human spirit present in every culture, every civilization. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.